Hello, introduce yourself.
My name is Anna Ambrachowicz. I am a budding journalist. I hope I am interested in media and in the current affairs, especially in a region of Central and Eastern Europe.
All right, thank you, Anna. Shall we get into our discussion about what the Ukraine war is doing to Europe politically? We can talk a bit about a few of the recent elections and some of the changing political situation in various countries, especially in Eastern Europe.
We're starting with Hungary, are we?
Yeah, let's
Come on,
start
let's
with
start with
Hungary.
Hungary.
2 weeks ago was election day, and the current government, Fidesz, won again with an even bigger majority. The unexpected campaign that came up was obviously the war in Ukraine, which was pounced on by both the opposition and the government as a new way to battle it out, a new topic. So the government won, and their rhetoric was the opposition would send Hungarians to war to Ukraine, and the government would protect the people and would not put Hungarians at risk. They would provide peace and prosperity, and that was the basic rhetoric. And after they won the election, Orban gave a victory speech where he described Zelensky as an opponent of him and Hungary in general, which was a bit distasteful. So he publicly sided with Putin and Russia. Now he took a bit back from that since he already won. He's dialing it back a bit and saying that he promotes peace talks and he wants the war to be over, or at least the ceasefire. But he's not condemning Russia or providing support for Ukraine. And his position seems to have strengthened with this new election by quite a lot.
Yes, so could I ask you about the sources telling about the votes that were found in Romania from the postal voting?
We can talk about this. Actually affected me personally. There was a massive scandal of opposition votes being found in Romania in the trash. So basically, the votes were thrown out, the opposition votes, and not the votes for the government, for Fidesz. And then Fidesz said that actually this was probably a ploy by the opposition to make them look bad, and they threw out their own votes, which does sound ridiculous, but basically that's what happened. And it's actually quite difficult to vote from abroad. It's a lot of bureaucracy, and I initiated the bureaucracy 3 months ago, so I would be able to vote from abroad, but they didn't do it quickly enough, but they already signed me out of the Hungarian registry, but didn't put me into the new registry, the abroad UK registry. So they basically denied my chance to vote. And I suspect a lot of these kind of things have happened where there was no oversight by opposition vote counters. So from these two examples, this had probably happened to more people at more places, and it's very unreliable, the votes coming from abroad, to reflect the true voting of how people voted for Fidesz or not.
Okay, amazing. And just as actually, I talked about this with my mom, that, as you know, has pro-right sympathies, and she's very charmed by Viktor Orban.
Right.
Because she's very loyal in nature. When we talked about this, she basically, her argument was that, as stupid as it sounds, that these votes were not from this voting, but from different voting, because they were from a few weeks ago. And could I ask you, how many weeks ahead before the election day you are allowed to send your votes via postal service?
So when it's postal
In
service,
Hungary.
you obviously have to send your votes before, because you need to allow time for the votes to arrive to be counted
So,
in time with
so when
the
did it?
in-person votes. So
So the
the
window, when did it open?
I'm not sure when it opened, but I couldn't register anymore after, I think it was, I'm not sure, but it was about 3 weeks before the election. That's when the window to register closed. So I would suspect that the votes would have to be sent soon after.
Okay, amazing. Because
So the
I think
timeline
it's
lines
there.
up with a couple of weeks before.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to ask this question specifically for sympathizers like my mom.
I
I mean,
can
I
I
still love
can
my
I can
mom.
look up the exact dates and send it to you after this,
Mm-hmm.
if you are
I just would
interested.
like to. Oh, thank you. I just would like to mention from like the Polish side that Catholic fundamentalist organization Ordo Iuris from Poland, that has also international connections, that was directly involved in introduction in Poland of abortion ban, that led last 1 year and a half to the biggest protests in last 30 years in Poland. Came to Hungary as an independent observer of election process, apparently to provide balanced and view, because they said that Viktor Orban is heckled by the opposition.
Wow,
That's just
amazing.
like small Polish accent, yes.
Amazing. Yeah, a lot of people have
Yeah.
actually volunteered to be observers for the vote count, so there would be no foul play present, but obviously they can't prevent it with postal votes. We can talk about Hungary a bit more later, but I think it's important to put this into perspective of some of the other countries that have had or are having elections right now, and how the Ukrainian war will influence the results. So Serbia had the elections the same day as Hungary, and Vucic won again. So I'm not exactly familiar with the situation in Serbia, but it seems to be a similar situation in that the ruling power have remained and even strengthened their position despite or because of the war. So it didn't seem to cause an upheaval in politics that way.
Yeah, so I can, from my perspective, add a few things. I was working before in Croatia. To be honest, I am definitely not in a place to be an expert on Serbia, especially that Croatia and Serbia as countries have a very rough history together. At the same time, I have been interested in the region for a few years, and I things I know for sure is that Serbia under Mr. Vucic generally became less and less democratized. During coronavirus pandemic, portal like Balkan Insights was informing that the opposition activists were imprisoned for breaching of apparently COVID restrictions. Then COVID restrictions were lifted when there were elections, but not those elections, different elections 2 years ago. He's known for being quite brutal with the protesters, but by protesters I mean on various initiatives, not necessarily political ones, and that the media landscape in Serbia is very difficult. The media landscape, unfortunately, lacks plurality. About 80% of news consumers in Serbia are watching state media, which is pro-government. The independent media are consumed by 20%, and the independent media in Serbia are facing many challenges. First, from the market, because it's very difficult for them to thrive financially, and second one, because they are repeatedly accused of being not patriotic when they are reporting by the state media and by the government. I am also not an expert in Hungary, so and I don't really follow the whole process, the political
I can
process in
add on
Hungary.
that.
So
So in Hungary, there is independent or opposition media is being drowned out constantly by government forces. So last year, for example, this one of the biggest opposition newspapers, Index, was bought out by the government, and there was a huge walkout by the editors, and they started a new site, Telex, which is the inheritor of Index. A couple of days ago, they issued an article which I was very horrified by. The title said that Ukrainian refugees are bringing in tuberculosis and HIV to Hungary, and most of them could be unvaccinated as well against COVID. And that was the headline. So this media source that used to be anti-government is now spewing this very hateful anti-refugee rhetoric, very similar to the 2015 situation with Hungary and a lot of other countries in Europe, whipping up anti-refugee rhetoric, and that article was in the exact same vein. So it was quite surprising to see how, as most countries and media support Ukraine in this situation and the refugees, this site just issued this most hateful article. I really, there's no other word to describe it.
I can just say one thing, that what's very inhumane and disgusting in such a rhetoric is using real problems to spread hate. It is actually a fact that Ukraine has the highest HIV prevalence outside Africa, and has one of the highest rates of increase of HIV and AIDS cases in Europe, and that's basically the source of this is the spread of AIDS during the economic crisis in the 90s, and the abuse of drugs, but using this as an argument to stoke hate against refugees that the bombs have bombed is just disgusting. Yeah.
Yeah, either way, the fact remains that equating refugees to a virus, a foreign virus that's coming to invade is not a nice move. Yeah.
Yeah, equating refugees to people spreading AIDS and HIV is disgusting.
Yeah. So we can touch on the upcoming elections in France and maybe some opinions of what will happen, how the war will affect this, and
Okay,
maybe affect political
so
situation in broader sense of Europe. What do you think?
yeah, I really hope like this will came out like before the elections in France. So or maybe our discussion will be still valid. So we are before the second round of the elections. And Le Pen, that never had such a big support as now. I mean, she never was so close to winning as now. Is facing Emmanuel Macron, who is also has his drawbacks. But yeah, so my question was, that the thing we were talking before, do you think that the war can like stop the spread of far right? And you were saying that the war can make position of Macron stronger, right?
Yeah, I don't think that this situation with the refugees will strengthen the far right or will in the same way that the previous refugee situation from Syria and Afghanistan and Middle East did. There is again a refugee crisis in Europe, although I do not like to use that word, but there is again a lot of refugees going from east to west to Europe, but now they're from Ukraine. So I don't think it will have the same effect on a lot of far right movements in Europe, and they're strengthening because far right ideology is built on white supremacy, at least here in Europe, and racism and Islamophobia. So, because the refugees from Ukraine are mostly white and Christian and whatever, they won't acceptance of them into the country won't strengthen the far right. But on the other hand, the far right is also ultra nationalistic and wants to preserve strong borders and a nation state and army
Mm-hmm.
and but on that count actually this might not play into their hand. They might not be able to use this because Macron is quite similar to the far right in that respect, that he is one of the main advocates of Europe having their own army and having stronger borders and be
Is of
nationalist.
his biggest advocate of what?
He is one of the biggest advocates in terms of like powerful leaders within the EU of Europe
Mm-hmm.
having its own army and having strong borders, right? Strong external borders.
Mm.
And for example, Frontex, the
Have you said that my Manuel is like advocate of far right in terms of
no,
like
no, no,
having
no, no.
strong board?
He's not.
No.
He's not an advocate of far right. But these
Mm-hmm.
policies that the far right likes,
Mm-hmm.
Macron also supports. So the far right won't be able to use them against Macron, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because Macron also. So I
Yeah.
think this might actually strengthen Macron. So I'm not sure about the far right, and Le Pen, but I don't think they will get stronger from this situation.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on the point that that actually in the current conflict, the arguments that were usually mostly used by the right spectrum of the politics is becoming mainstream in terms of defense, because in the current situation it's quite obvious, and like I don't really that won't be argument anymore, because many European countries now are increasing the budgets for military spending. What I think, I was wondering if the war in Russia, the war that was created by Russia, can stop far right, specifically in the front the French, but not only the French context. Because you see, I don't know if we would need to cut it out or if I would need to rephrase it. But Marine Le Pen, right?
Yeah.
For a long time, she was a proponent of ultranationalism, of strong borders, and of anti-Muslim and anti-refugee rhetoric on the basis of the other, right? Like looking for the other.
Yes.
But and I also think that, like, for example, the ban, the some stuff that Macron did was a little bit like fitting into that rhetoric, right? To get the votes from right
Yes.
spectrum of voters. But now I think because now we have a different, the political situation is changing. Because now in the face of war, it's Europe is acting as one, more like, of course, the different countries with different objectives, but we talked about this before, we are like on the eve of creating a new Iron Curtain, right?
Yeah.
And many countries will be forced to cooperate with each other and create a new coalitions. So this previous idea that was quite like full of life, like few months or years ago, of like nation state and being within the borders, I don't think it's holding much ground now, because now states have to cooperate for many reasons, more trivial and more like principal ones. And I think many arguments that were used before by the far right will lose friction. And also Marine Le Pen can lose her friction, because especially now that the war is so brutal, right? And there have been not dramatic pictures from occupied and then liberated towns, right? Of massacred civilians, of reports of children, women tortured, and so on and so forth. Her views, especially her pro-Russian views, might basically make people against her. And I know that war is not perceived in every country everywhere, as I am Polish and we are basically on the front line, almost. We have different view and different resources, but some pictures of this war are very international, and they get to everyone. The protests that were happening a few days ago, some of the voices of the protesters reported by the media were, I don't really like Macron, but Le Pen is basically the worst. So I just wonder if in the face of this war, it may be that some postulates she's proposing will lose its friction.
Right. That's an interesting idea. Yeah, I agree with some of that.
Especially that now it's very, it was always mentioned for many years that she has been directly financed from Kremlin. And now, in the face of the war, it's really widely spoken. Should French people, in the face of this conflict, introduce to the government somebody that's so closely connected with Russia, basically? Is it even safe for France?
Yeah, so I think that's a very valid concern of is Europe putting up a unified front against Russia, right? And there's definitely some outliers. So, for example, Hungary, and as you said, this nation state and have to defend our own borders, and like very compartmentalized countries, like what Brexit was built upon, that sort of philosophy might not be fit for this situation. And Fidesz is still trying to push this narrative, definitely, and saying that all responsibility is for our people primarily. For example, those Hungarians living in Ukraine, and we cannot put them into danger, and our people first, and believe in the nation state. But this sort of nationalism is definitely something that will face alienation in this context within Europe. So, for
Yeah.
example, Hungary and Poland have been for the past few years allies against the EU, sanctions against them. But I'm just wondering, for example, now with Poland taking this more open border approach and very pro Ukraine, will Hungary lose
Mhm.
its one ally? And I think this connects to France as well. Would France want to go down that path? Probably not. So
The path of, sorry, I
path of
didn't understand.
Hungary. So being alienated if,
Um,
for example, Le Pen got elected and maybe pushed some of those policies. Also, although I do think that's quite far-fetched. Uh, but definitely affiliation with Russia right now is not going to get you into good books of many EU countries.
yeah, I just wanted to ask you, if this front of protest, do you think that Hungarian government at the moment is trying to hide how much it is infiltrated by Russia in all
Uh,
its rhetoric?
I I don't think it's trying to hide how much it's infiltrated by Russia. I think it's more building. It's more trying to be consistent in a way. A lot of the
Mm,
rhetoric has been built on anti-EU, anti-immigration, anti-open borders, and the fact of balancing East and West, and saying that actually maybe democratic process not the best, and maybe uh, illiberal democracy is the way forward. So I think Orban is not trying to contradict his previous rhetoric here,
mm,
but that is something that's quite unpopular internationally right now.
yeah. So we could come over to Poland now.
Sure.
Yes. So the question that you wanted to ask me was, or like, no, the thing you thought is like, is the war making government stronger? I am not sure if I can say that the war is strengthening Polish government position. Externally, definitely yes. Internally, to people that vote, it's complicated. For sure, Poland resigned from the approach that had for many, many years of focusing on domestic issues, although not completely. So at the moment, we have a situation when, on one side, Polish government is making much more international trips. They're negotiating with the government. They're doing trips with other with representatives of other governments to put sanctions on Russia, to show support to Ukraine, and other stuff. So that was external. Internally, we have a very complicated situation. Basically, this government is populist one. They spent a lot of money, which was not very always well invested to get votes. At the moment, we have the highest inflation in 30 years. 6 months, a few months ago, 3 months ago, a tax reform was introduced that cut salaries of literally everyone, and people were fuming to this day and planning on protests. And I know this information from the first hand, as my family is working in an industry that was affected by this tax cut. I think what was the most infuriating was that that officially it was called tax reform and tax cut. In practice, it cut real salaries of everyone. So that's a second, I would say second or third in a row in 2 years, drastic move that is basically turning the whole population against the government. I think the first big one, that was the second one, but the second really big one and the biggest one was the abortion ban. Basically, introducing this tax reform this year, they repeated what they did a year ago, and literally within a few days made everybody fuming. It was happening in January. It was before the Ukrainian war, but the consequences are felt to this day. And the experts are saying that it will be felt for next 2 years at least. If you add giant inflation, people are always voting using their pockets. So yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree on that. People are voting with their pockets.
Yes.
So, for example, the Hungarian government actually fixed some of the prices of things like chicken breasts and whatnot, and reducing utility bills and stuff like that. And I think those very simple policies were so much stronger than anything about the war or any of that that's not immediately felt by people's living standards.
Yeah,
So,
you see that. Okay, please continue.
that's just my point, that as long as people's living standards are staying the same or rising, or they at least feel that way, that is the case. It is difficult to convince people of some war happening far away and why they should care about that.
So basically, one of the responses for the fixing for the inflation was actually lowering the taxes and fixing prices, but that didn't really went well with the public as well, because fixing prices in Poland has a connotation of economic crisis. Also, let's not forget that as amazing as receiving 2.5 million refugees from Ukraine looks, it's also a giant logistical endeavor, and Poland is not ready for this endeavor. And we have a government that is too proud to ask for help of Western countries. At the same time, there are some people in the government, like Polish president and some officials, that really started doing their job, and that's good. But if that will make them stay in power, I don't know. I'm not sure. Yeah, so should we talk about Belarus? It will be really quick.
Sure.
In terms of Belarus, I think that is definitely not covered internationally, or maybe it is, but I don't know about this. We could maybe mention the change of rhetoric of Belarusian opposition. So, Daniel, what do you know about Belarusian opposition?
I know about the massive protests and the opposition leader going into exile and all that good stuff. But I don't know what is happening right now.
Okay, so I don't know much either, except that Norway put the candidature of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the said leader of the opposition, to Nobel Peace Prize. But I think what's interesting going forward is, as we know, before Ukraine was attacked by Russia in 2014, there was quite a big divide of the country because there were different pro and anti-Soviet sentiments. And there was like this stereotype that Eastern Ukraine is pro-Russian and Western Ukraine is more nationalistic and wants to go to the West. And then when Russia attacked, many people changed their points of view, and there was like this pro-nationalistic insurgents. Basically, even few months ago, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, in the interviews she was giving to Western media, when she was asked what position Belarus should have internationally, right? She was always explaining that the Belarusian protests are pro-democratic protests, and they are not pro-Western or anti-Western or pro-Russian or anti-Russian. They just want to get Lukashenko out. They want to have normal, stable government, and they just don't want a dictator. And she was saying, I mean, this was reflecting of like traditional stance of Belarus of balancing basically between the West and the East, what Lukashenko was also doing for many years. And she said, I remember this phrase, is that wrong in the 21st century for a country to be friends with everyone? And her political stance was basically to find a balance between cooperation with Western countries, but also relation with Russia, which was understandable.
Right. So do you think that her comment about is it possible for a country to be friends with everyone, do you think that's possible now, or are we really seeing the start of a Cold War where there is a complete breakdown of communication and you have to choose a side?
I think we are, because recently she changed her position. Since few weeks, she basically in the media, she's openly saying that Belarus should be treated as a country under temporary Russian occupation. Belarusians and Ukrainians have a long history of friendship, despite having completely two different political systems. They are very, very, very close culturally, and if Putin ever wanted to have this rhetoric of like two lands being culturally close, he should actually use it towards Belarus and Ukrainian lands. Even the languages are basically like, you know, they're super close, like super, super, super close. They really don't need any translation when they're speaking like with each other. And actually, currently in the Ukrainian army, they are fighting troops of Belarusian volunteers, and they are partisans in Belarus that are disturbing Russian trains in transporting soldiers and stuff to Ukraine. I also think they blew up some trucks, but I don't. Oh no, they tried to blow up some partisans in Belarus. They tried to blow up some trucks, but they were stopped by Russians. So my point is that yes, I think currently the cooperation is impossible, and actually everyone is choosing its side. And I think as we speak, Belarusian opposition also chose its side, despite long tradition.
So you have to choose a side then.
I mean, yeah, you have to. I mean, in their case, you have to because it's like very dramatic situation now.
Right. Yeah, I think I agree with you, and there's definitely a strengthening of the border, and at the same time where there is more maybe international cooperation within Europe in that way, that countries have to pose a united front, there is also a massive break in and east of Europe. When
Yeah, but
I
do you think in the future, right? Like if like the democratic transition, for example, in Belarus succeeds, Russia might end up losing not only like influence on Ukraine, but on Belarus as well.
It might happen, but I think that's very speculative.
Mm.
I actually wanted to talk about one of the biggest factors of why some of the countries might not want to go against Russia, and how it might affect not just politics, but also environmental policy and all that stuff, is gas and oil coming from Russia, right?
Mm.
Supplying the rest of Europe, really. And I have 2 points about that, which is it is the reason many of the countries were initially hesitant to provide support to Ukraine, and for example, one of the reasons Orban said as well, that he doesn't want Hungarian families to be affected by, for example, the rising prices of utilities if they go to war with Russia. And Germany as well being hesitant about helping Ukraine because they're importing a lot of gas from Russia. And I wanted to say that this is not just a political situation, it's also an environmental reversal of priorities. So, for example, I don't know how much you know about this, but here in the UK, there was quite a sudden shift in from going sustainable, and the priority being the reduction of oil and gas and renewable energies. Suddenly the important policy became energy security, and for the UK to produce its own oil and gas, and suddenly environmental concerns being pushed to the back, and the opening of new oil fields in the North Sea suddenly becoming plausible and even wanted, and how that this whole situation, this war, could be a massive blow to environmental policy and renewable energy, when if all countries in Europe scramble to get the last bit of fossil fuels out to secure their
Yeah,
supply.
but I don't. There's one thing. I heard one thing about Russia infiltrating far right, but I also heard about Russia infiltrating far left and ultra pro ecological groups. Because some arguments those groups are making are basically, I am not a specialist on transition to ecology or ecological transition, right? But some arguments those groups are making are very strangely pro-Russian, and this has nothing to do with ecology. A world can continue ecological transition at the same time, not at the expense of people dying. And I know it will, it's not according to the plan. But at the same time, this plan was like very heavily influenced by powerful lobbies as well. So, yeah, there is an emergency, and I just don't really think using fossil fuels from Russia versus using your own fossil fuels is necessarily putting ecology in danger, as long as you're willing to continue transition, because that was the point, right? I
Yeah,
just
but
heard I'm sorry that I mentioned it, but like recently I've there's one podcast I'm listening to of Witold Jurasz, who is a foreign policy specialist in Poland, and he mentioned the protest, the Greenpeace activists signed from Spain and France, I think. They signed a letter which basically said that like human death is not important as long as we are keeping up importing gas and oil from Russia and we continue to ecological transition. It's like why importing gas and oil from Russia is necessary for ecological transition. You can't import it from somewhere else. And like we are doing ecological transition to save life and save the future of people, right?
Right.
So I think as long as the principles are being kept, of course it will be more difficult. But at the same time, the ultimate goal was resigning from fossil fuels. So will it happen with or without Russian help? As long as the end goal is like sustained, it's okay, I think. Also, I think Europe. I think the Green New. That's what. How was it called? Green Deal in Europe.
Green New Deal, yeah.
Of course, Green New Deal. I think is a giant plan, right? And it required a lot of analytics and stuff. But I think Europe is like really set in their goals, in their sustainable goals. So I am sure that they will do a lot to uphold this course. At the same time, if the war won't be stopped now and it will continue later, it will not really help. That will be for a few years having a transition, because like let's be honest, it's not like if Ukraine, for example, surrender now, right? If nothing has been done to help it, do you think that when the war would stop?
So do you think if Ukraine surrendered now, you mean an unconditional surrender?
Do you think do you think if Ukraine like surrendered, do you think the war could be stopped?
It depends on what kind of surrender. If it's an unconditional surrender, where they just say, okay, Russia, you can do whatever you want, then the war is over, right?
I don't think so, because if you look at the Russian media, right, they are they are not, Russian state media were full of like theories about Ukraine being like little brother and failed state and they're saving them. But if you look at the media, also Poland is featured on Russian media. There's like this dude, I forgot his last name. And I saw a clip recently when he said like, Poland is so poor, we wanted to help them, but they decided to sell themselves to the West. So, like, why not save Lithuania and Latvia and Poland as well?
So
You never stop saving, Daniel.
Are you saying that you think after Ukraine, Russia would expand
that my country could be
further
next?
into it?
Yes. Yes. Because what's behind Russian idea? Why Russia needs Ukraine, Daniel?
Yeah. Imperialism, of course.
Yeah, imperialism never stops. Imperialism never stops. This is a mentality that's very difficult to fight. Like, look at like this sentiment that was in like Brexit Britain, right? It was like this nostalgia after being great. And in Russia, the nostalgia is very, very strong. And that's one of the reasons of that is they never really benefited from not being imperialistic, because they never even tried. They never did like reforms that would really help them feel, like the stuff that countries that are maybe not as imperialistic, but they still enjoy, one of the reasons why, for example, Poland doesn't have this trend of now grabbing parts of Ukraine. Why?
Right. So you are saying that Russia is an imperious power and they are still living in that nostalgia of imperial greatness, and it's a revival of that rhetoric.
Yes, I am saying when the quality of life is failing, and you don't have much to offer to the society, to your own people, you have to find something else to make people follow you.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
that can, yeah. So I don't think that will be like they will take Ukraine and everything will be good, because there's so many countries that you can conquer. There's so many territories that were Russian in the past. I mean, come on, whole Central Asia. You know that what I noticed looking at the news, different news. It's like in most of the countries that before were part of USSR, there's a common trend. Everybody in every of these countries, they are convinced that they will be next. And I'm not talking only about Poland. Like I heard that even in Kazakhstan, people have a thing like this.
Yeah, I mean, it is incredibly scary when Russia starts
Yeah,
invading former USSR territories. Um,
yeah.
so we are now talking about much bigger potential of much bigger war and the potential for a complete revival of the Cold War.
I think Cold War will be slowly revived already.
Yeah, I definitely think that's happening already, especially with China, but now Russia is kicking into next gear.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we will see what will happen. At least we will have an interesting life to look back on.
Yeah, we have interesting podcasts to make, you know.
A little bit too
It's
long, but like,
it's
yeah,
it's all worth
yeah.
it at the end.
Sorry?
It's all worth it in the end because we have some good content. So that is all for today. Thank you, Anna, for that very insightful perspective. Do you have any final words?
Yeah, that I'm drinking Shiraz and it's good.
I'm drinking beer and it's great. It's a British Amber Bitter and it was pretty good. Maybe next podcast we can drink the same thing and give a concise review. Yeah.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah.
Let's
Let's
finish
do
up
this.
and we'll be back
Okay.
next week with some amazing news again, probably, and some
Yay!
amazing topics to discuss. So, looking forward to that.
Yay!
Funs and giggles, everyone.
Yay!
All right, bye.
Bye.